Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 5 ways to fix the Hunter quest, the Marsh Queen, which you can see here on the screen. This is a big surprise, really. Before Engro came out, so many people thought the Marsh Queen would be the be-all, end-all of quests, just because getting 1-drops out so fast and being rewarded for that style of play seemed like it would be just too aggressive for the meta to handle. But as it turns out, in fact, the Marsh Queen is just way too inconsistent, and it's darn near impossible to actually activate this thing on time at a point where it actually would matter in the game. You have to sacrifice so much of your deck's raw consistency and frankly raw power because you're running too many low-cost cards that just don't do enough. But beyond that, even the reward for the Marsh Queen seems like a bit of a failure. You know, Queen Carnassa is a fine 5-mana 8/8 play, but beyond that, the Raptors, you don't necessarily get a new Raptor every time to draw a card and cycle into a second Raptor, into a third Raptor, etc. So you end up drawing a Raptor and then drawing a 1-drop that just sucks because you put it in your deck to activate your quest, and the whole thing falls apart really rather quickly. And because of that, we just haven't seen a really high-tier deck make the Marsh Queen work, which I think is a big problem because, you know, you want legendaries to at least be playable in some regard when it comes to other sort of just random neutral legendaries we've seen in past sets or just class legendaries. There's always some way you can just add them into a deck. The problem with a card like the Marsh Queen and other quests that don't work is simply that if they don't work, you can't play them at all. You can't just try to build a deck around it. You'll never find any success because it's not just a random 1 card in 30, it's a card that forces you to build an entire deck around. So people who get this card in a pack on a budget, new players, they might think it works and they get a really bad experience simply because the design of the card has failed. And that's essentially why I think it's important to both recognize and address those deficits, but also present some ways, in fact, to perhaps make it better. Of course, I'm not convinced Blizzard would actually make any of these changes, but I still think it's a really healthy and frankly fun exercise to go through and say, how could this card have been designed a little bit differently? And I think that'll guide players and Blizzard in future expansions as we both digest cards that are coming out in the future, determining whether or not we think they'll be good, so we don't overhype stuff like the Marsh Queen, but also perhaps to give someone at Blizzard a little bit of guidance along the way so that they might make some changes to ensure that cards are a little bit better on average, but also that major whiffs like this with really important cards in a set don't happen in the future. So all of that said, let's go ahead and jump into this list for my 5 ways to make this card better. Up first is that you could actually just increase the quest's mana requirement. In other words, right now it forces you to play 1 mana minions to actually make it 2 mana minions instead. So 2 mana or less. So you could play 1-drops or 2-drops to still fulfill the quest. And essentially that means that your deck is just a little bit less weak as far as mana curve is concerned when you're building out a deck to satisfy the quest. Because right now you have to run so many of those weak 1-drops that it's just every draw on average is much worse. But there are some really important good 2-drops available to Hunter, particularly with Unguro with things like Crackling Razor Maw. So being able to run those without feeling guilty about it or without decreasing the likelihood that you're able to satisfy your quest is going to make your deck stronger on average. It's going to make your draws a little bit more consistent on average as far as what's playable and utilizing a full complement of mana every turn as opposed to floating a couple extra mana or being forced to use your hero power with excess mana, all of which are much weaker on-board plays. Essentially, I think this would allow you to get closer to a true mid-range Hunter deck that also gets to complete the quest. You'd still have to run it a little bit more aggressively. But at the end of the day, when you're playing the quest on turn 1, which typically steals your 1-drop anyway and steals that initiative from you, you can actually follow it up with a strong 2-drop, and then on turn 3 you can play a 2-drop and a 1-drop, and suddenly you've got 3 completions without falling probably too far behind on the board. On turn 4 you could play 2 2-drops, etc. It just gives you that smoother progression throughout the mana curve that also allows you to just play stronger cards, especially some of the great new cards out now. And all in all, this would both help your deck be more successful regardless of the quest. You don't have to sacrifice quite as much, but also helps you hit the quest arguably twice as fast, or at least faster without compromising. And I think both of those would be really important changes because, as we know, the quest reward itself right now isn't really overpowered. There's nothing about it that's super strong. So making it much easier to achieve wouldn't really be a problem. It wouldn't swing it too far in the other direction, making the quest overpowered. So frankly, maybe you could even make this 3 mana or less and still help fit kind of the mentality, right? Because it would slow down a little bit if you're playing 3 mana cards, but again, just allow you to make your deck better at a raw power level mana curve standpoint. So I do think this would actually be a really positive change that's subtle, it's easy, it's elegant, but still makes the Marsh Queen a solid card. Moving on to my second suggestion, this is one that's really driven by Quest Rogue and the success we've seen there. As it turns out, making minions that you play for 1 mana 5/5s in stats isn't actually that broken. I mean, Quest Rogue, clearly a good deck that's frustrating to play against from time to time, that's able to summon 5/5 minions, but often those 5/5 minions have charge in Quest Rogue or do something with a battle cry that's really, really powerful. The Raptors in Queen Carnassa's deck could be a similar kind of minion, but remember that I think that this is still actually harder to achieve than Quest Rogue's quest activation is. So you'd get kind of the same reward. You'd get 5/5s, except they wouldn't have charge, which is an important distinction in this particular suggestion. And it'd be harder to get them. So I still don't know that this would make the deck better than Quest Rogue. I think it would do it differently. It would play a little uniquely compared to Quest Rogue. The reward would start to feel a little bit more similar, where you could develop 3 or 4 or 5/5 minions in a single turn because you're drawing your Raptors and so on and so forth. But remember, other minions in your deck would not become 5/5s. So if you top decked a Queen Carnassa Raptor, played it as a 5/5, you top decked, therefore, a new draw after that, say you just got a Fiery Bat, another 1-drop you ran in your deck, it would still be a 2/1. And it would be a good play. You'd get to play a 1 mana 5/5 and a 1 mana 2/1. That would be strong, but compared to Quest Rogue, it still wouldn't be quite that overpowered. So I think this would be sort of a balanced halfway step between what Quest Rogue does and what the new Marsh Queen would actually do, that would make it much more swingy, because you could sometimes develop 3 5/5s in a single turn, whereas right now you just kind of develop a few 3/2s, and that's just not that strong of a play, so the reward is not worth the risk of compromising your deck. This skews a little bit higher in that reward category, so the risk of trying to make Marsh Queen work could be worth it if the reward is strong enough. Frankly, I'm still not sure this would actually be strong enough. It's, like I said, not as good as what Quest Rogue can do, and Quest Rogue just barely makes the cut as far as like top tier decks. So this could be actually too small of a change, even though it seems pretty substantial, basically doubling the stats of a minion that you get as a reward. They might need to do even more than just be 5/5s. Perhaps they need to destroy every other card in your deck so that you're guaranteed to draw as many Raptors as you have mana per turn. That's the kind of thing that would make it feel a little bit closer to what Quest Rogue actually achieves. But nonetheless, there needs to be some sort of stat change or minion boost if you want these reward Raptors to actually be significant. You have to do something more than just make them 3/2s that draw a card, because ultimately that's just too slow as far as impacting the board is concerned. Moving on to my third suggestion, this is one that really scares people, I bet, because we've all seen that sort of highlight from pre-Unguro where you played Tundra Rhino and then you drew 5 straight Raptors and they all had charge and it was worth a ton of damage. And I understand why that might scare you, but ultimately I think if you just gave the Raptors charge by default, you didn't even need the Tundra Rhino for this kind of combo, I still don't actually think that that would be overpowered. Simply because at a max, if you drew perfectly, and if you played Queen Carnassa on, say, turn 6, and then on turn 7, you drew Raptor into Raptor into Raptor into Raptor, and you got 7 Raptors, that's still only 21 damage for 7 mana, which is clearly a lot. That's often enough to kill your opponent. But remember, it took a long time to get that far. You had to get to turn 7 before you could make that play. That is like the dream scenario. Sometimes you're still going to draw that Fiery Bat that breaks your combo and means you only get 9 charging damage. Your opponent has had 7 turns to do their thing anyway, which often means developing a giant wall of taunts if you're Taunt Warrior, or just out aggroing you and killing you if they're Pirate Warrior, etc., etc. Depending on their game plan, you've been sacrificing board and time and efficiency to achieve this reward. So you've given your opponent plenty of time to win the game already or stabilize already. So this reward, keep that in mind. You're sacrificing a lot to get to this new, much better reward. So at the end of the day, again, I think you can compare this to Quest Rogue, and ultimately it's not any better, because Quest Rogue already does this, except they do it with 5/5 minions, and they do it with patches and Stone Tusk Borers, etc. We've all seen those turns where they Stone Tusk Borer, Shadow Step, Stone Tusk Borer, Shadow Step, Stone Tusk Borer for 15 damage, and I don't even think this reward would do that nearly as consistently is what Quest Rogue can do. Not to mention that after that happens, the opponent could Holy Nova and stabilize and clear your board again, and you're back to square one. Whereas with Quest Rogue, that's a much harder thing to actually clear up and clean up and recover from. So again, I think this would just give the deck a lot more swing potential, so that when you play Queen Carnassa and then the following turn you can perhaps kill them outright with some burst damage if you get lucky. Maybe you can just make some really efficient trades with charging minions, etc. Maybe you can set up a big Scavenging Hyena with the charging 3/2 Raptors. I don't know, but it gives you more options. It gives you more potential to flip a board back in your favor, which is really important for quests to be successful. They have to do something that allows you to swing the game and start to pull ahead. And this is the kind of change that would do that, because it'd give those reward Raptors instant activation instead of just developing what turns out to be, Bloodfin Raptors most of the time. That gives your opponent all the initiative and all the control over how those minions are actually resolved on the board. This would flip that back in your favor and give you the initiative and give you the control over how you utilize your quest reward. And I still don't think it'd be overpowered, even though charge is ultimately a really scary thing, I understand. It feels like, unless there's some sort of gimmick I haven't seen or some sort of weird interaction with buffing damage, that there's no Savage Roar necessarily. You could perhaps do some things like Bestial Wrath to make it a little bit scarier, but still, all of those things make your deck worse and make you more likely to lose by the time you get to this point. Because remember, I haven't changed any of the activation requirements in this particular suggestion. This is only the reward. So the deck is still pretty bad to get this far, and it's really hard to activate the Marsh Queen to get this far. So at the end of the day, I just don't think this one is too much. I think it's actually a pretty balanced change that would make the card feel a lot better to play and activate the quest. Up next at the fourth suggestion, this one's actually probably my favorite, and I think it may be just the most simple and elegant of every solution. And that's that you could make the quest reward Raptors simply draw 2 cards instead of drawing a single card. Because as I've mentioned a few times at this point, sometimes when you play that Raptor and you draw a card, it's the best option is cycling it into a new Raptor and drawing a new card. And you get this super efficient chain of card draw and minion deposits on the board. But other times you hit that Fiery Bat and it interrupts your entire plan, and suddenly you're just out of gas and out of steam. But if the Raptors drew 2 cards every turn, you just greatly increase the likelihood that there's always an additional Raptor at the top of the deck. And instead of card draw luck being sort of your cap on what you can accomplish in a turn, it's much more likely that your cap just becomes how much mana you have available. So this gives you the opportunity to really refill your hand while still playing stuff on the board, so that in control matchups that aren't super aggro or super damage based, you can just generate a ton of card advantage while still also playing minions to help you keep up on the board, which is not unfair compared to what other quests are able to accomplish with their rewards. So I think this is just a really simple flip of the switch, up 1 number on the card text, and suddenly maybe it's worth risking running the Marsh Queen as far as activations are concerned, because this reward does give you a lot more consistency in the second half of your matchups. It does exactly what the quest design was originally intended to do, but makes it just that little bit much better that could perhaps push it over the edge as far as a competitively viable deck is concerned. And then finally, for my 5th suggestion, this one might be a little bit of a cop-out, even I'll admit that, but you could simply just give Hunter more consistent card draw. Because right now, as it stands, there's just not enough card draw. They can't do enough, especially in the early game, to refill their hand and keep bringing in resources to help satisfy this quest. Because as it works right now, you have to just run so many 1-drops to make this quest activation consistent enough that you run out of gas. You play 1-drop, 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 your hand is empty, and there's just no card draw in Hunter to make up for that fact. So giving hunters some more early game card draw in particular, right? Stuff like maybe a 2-drop that draws you a card, 1-drops that draw you a card. Who knows, right? Just some sort of cycle that doesn't completely go counter to their game plan and their strategy of early minions on the board and just raw aggression. If you accomplish that, then you can build a much better deck around the Marsh Queen. You can just balance it out, make it smoother, make it more consistent as far as activating the quest is concerned without giving up everything you're trying to accomplish in the meantime. Right now, Hunter just doesn't have that card draw. Even with cards added like Tol'vir Warden that were clearly designed to make the quest a little bit more consistent and easy to activate, I just don't think that was enough. You need a couple more of those options, and perhaps earlier in the mana curve, because that is a 4-mana card, which could be a little bit slow to pull this off. So Hunters never really had that good of card draw. And even things like Stampede were also added, but those just didn't do the trick. Those aren't exactly what it needs, because the Stampede doesn't always give you more 1-drops or the cards that you want. It gives you random cards, which kind of breaks up your plan a little bit. So this is really going to be the way that Blizzard fixes this quest, and probably other quests that aren't very good either, is designing cards in future sets that somehow unlock some sort of synergy or some sort of deck building potential that suddenly make the quest good because you're able to satisfy those conditions much more successfully without compromising everything else in the meantime. So I know this isn't really a fix to the card itself, but more a fix to the class around the card to support the card, but I do think that's still an important distinction, because really at the end of the day, Blizzard kind of failed Hunter, or at least failed the quest via Hunter, because they didn't mesh that well and they didn't line up together to make a good fit, and this could fix that by building a class that actually does support its quest, and frankly, gives the class something it's lacked forever, which, you know, some might argue that's the identity of Hunter, is that it doesn't have card draw, but that's silly. It has in the past with things like the pre-nerf Starving Buzzard was a great way to draw cards, and I think it'd be fine to give Hunter more card draw in the future too. Everybody just needs cards. It's not fun to play the game without cards, so let's take that class identity, throw it out the window, and give Hunter some card draw to both make the class more fun in general, but also to make the quest better too. And there you have it. Those are my 5 fixes for the Hunter quest, the Marsh Queen. I'm really curious what you guys have to say about these fixes. I always like to hear your insights. Some people think my suggestions are overpowered. Some think they may not do quite enough. So share those thoughts in the comments below. What's your take? What would you do to make the quest better? What would finally make it good and competitive? What does Blizzard need to do? Share those insights, because I would love to read them. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.